Welcome to this explainer. Okay, let's dive right in today because we are deconstructing a truly legendary piece of cinematic history. We're going to explore this really fascinating gap between what audiences believe they're seeing and how a famous piece of history was actually constructed on film. We're looking at the simulation, the hidden machinery, really, behind the absolutely iconic 1995 Bangladeshi documentary, Muktir Gaan, or Song of Freedom.
Right off the bat, I want you to consider a pretty provocative question. Can a documentary contain fake scenes, stage moments, and even total recreations, and still tell the truth? It's a concept that really challenges our basic understanding of documentary film, of evidence, and of historical memory itself. So keep this tension in the back of your mind as we go through today's explainer.
All right, let's jump into Section 1, the ultimate war document.
To truly grasp the immense cultural myth surrounding Mukti Gaan, you really have to understand the sheer hunger the audience had for it. When the film came out in 1995, it ended this massive, decades-long drought of visual history about the 1971 Bangladesh Liberation War. I mean, most audiences had literally never seen color footage with synchronized sound of the war before. So when they finally saw this vibrant footage of a musical troupe traveling around to motivate refugees and fighters, they desperately embraced it. They embraced it as a flawless, 100% literal document of the war exactly as it happened. Moving on to Section 2, a thirst for evidence.
Now, over the decades, the stakes surrounding this film have shifted pretty dramatically, and this is an absolutely crucial point. In modern Bangladesh, there have been these really high-stakes war crimes trials regarding the events of 1971. And because actual visual records from that era are incredibly rare, there's a massive demand for visual proof. In fact, the film's sequel, which relies on this exact same original footage, has actually been admitted as legal evidence in a tribunal case that resulted in a death sentence. That is wild, right? It creates immense public pressure for Muktir Gaan to be this unblemished, forensic, completely factual record.
Which brings us to Section 3, uncovering the simulations. But here is the twist. We are now going to peel back the onion and uncover the actual cracks and simulations hidden inside this quote-unquote perfect document. And the crazy part? These are simulations that the filmmakers themselves have explicitly admitted to. To understand how it was constructed, we have to look at the guy holding the camera. American filmmaker Lear Levin. The directors of Muktir Gaan, Tariq and Catherine Masood, actually built their 1995 film by repurposing Levin's 1971 raw footage. And Levin? Well, he openly stated he didn't want a purist fly-on-the-wall approach. He preferred what he actually called a theatrical documentary style, where you use staging to make sure your point gets across.
This brilliantly illustrates our first major simulation, which we can call telescoping. See, Levin was heavily restricted by authorities who honestly suspected he was a spy, so he was only able to shoot for roughly 3 weeks in November of 1971. But the war lasted 9 months. When they got to the editing room in the 1990s, the Masouds expertly spliced this tiny 3-week window with book-ended archival newsreels to falsely but completely seamlessly represent the entire 9-month span of the war.
And then you have the micro-simulations, the staged scenes. Take this really famous sequence where the women in the troupe are reading a newspaper for updates from the war front. When you watch it, it feels like this beautiful, spontaneous, quiet moment of wartime reality. But listen to Levin's own words about that exact scene. He said he needed exposition, so he actually treated it like an acting exercise he'd learned from theater legend Uta Hagen. He said, and I quote, "I gave them those directions and then they went from there. I had to shoot it maybe 3 to 4 times. He set up master shots, reverse angles, cutaways, the whole shebang. It was highly constructed just to push the narrative forward."
Let's move to the film's climax, which features an incredibly emotional sequence. We see singer Swapan Chowdhury on a truck, seemingly in a trance, singing a fiercely political, hard-edged song about Uncle Sam and the U.S. 7th Fleet fleeing alongside the Pakistani army.
Well, hold on to your hats, because this is a massive recoding simulation. That song, it literally did not exist in 1971. Tariq Masood looked at this beautiful footage of Chowdhury singing a gentle folk song, realized it just didn't fit the grand political climax he needed, and completely wiped the original audio. He wrote brand new lyrics in the 1990s and had them dubbed over the footage to explain the geopolitical superpower duel between the US and the Soviets.
But perhaps the most staggering simulation of all isn't just an audio trick or a clever acting exercise. It's an entire combat sequence.
The film features this dramatic, incredibly tense night battle in the water. But, as the Masouds later revealed in a making-of documentary, this entire scene was recreated from scratch in 1994. That's over 2 decades after the war ended. And the reasons why they did this, it's actually a fascinating lesson in documentary constraints. Levin simply didn't have the technical ability back in 1971. His fastest lens couldn't capture night combat, and if he turned on his battery-operated lights, not only did it risk drawing lethal sniper fire, but it attracted so many swamp bugs that his assistant was entirely covered in moths and literally started whimpering, which totally ruined the audio track. So, to get the night battle they so desperately needed, the filmmakers hired local game members in 1994 to splash around in a cold pond and simulate real combat.
Let's move to Section 4, Constructing Historic Truth. All of this brings us to a really profound crossroad. What exactly does a polished, simulated narrative like this leave out? Troop member Libna Merriam, who was actually on that truck in 1971, issued a pretty stark warning. She argues that this stylized, simulated version of the war tragically leaves out the true terror, the blood, and the deep trauma experienced by the actual fighters. Her own teenage brother fought in the war, was deeply traumatized by the sheer brutality he witnessed, and tragically later took his own life. Merriam warns that the film's beautiful simulations risk intellectualizing and sanitizing a horrifically chaotic war.
Conversely, filmmaker Tarek Masoud offered a very different defense. For him, capturing the emotion and the broader arc of the war was what really mattered. As he put it, perhaps that scene did not happen in real life, but this is a historic truth within the Liberation War. For the filmmakers, that emotional and historical resonance completely outweighed the need for literal, factual exactness.
And that leads us nicely into Section 5, Facts, Belief, and Memory. Let's zoom out for a second and look at the audience. How do viewers process this massive gap between a constructed film and messy reality? The source material brilliantly uses the concept of the simulacrum to explain this. A simulacrum is basically a copy of the real that becomes truth in its own right. Because actual footage of the war was so incredibly scarce, this beautifully constructed, highly simulated copy essentially replaced the messy reality. It became the definitive, unquestioned truth for an entire nation.
And what is truly fascinating, honestly, is this phenomenon, a willing suspension of a skeptical eye. When the filmmakers actually released a 10th anniversary DVD that explicitly detailed all these recreations and simulations in a making-of documentary, the audience largely just ignored it. They essentially chose not to see the cracks. They transformed themselves into a believing public because the narrative had simply become sacrosanct.
Which leaves us with this really powerful, lingering thought. As time goes on and the demand for hard evidence in courtrooms collides with the art of cinematic storytelling, we have to ask ourselves, does an audience's desperate need for a sacred, unblemished history actually outweigh the need for exact forensic facts? It's a huge question, and one that goes far beyond just one documentary, challenging how every nation remembers its most defining moments. Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer, and I really hope this changes the way you look at the documentary footage you see every single day.